everyone, Todd here from Scoville Sound. This is a new video series called Reaper in the Weeds. In this series, we'll be diving in to comprehensively cover all aspects of specific Reaper functions, plugins, and production methods. Today, we're going to be talking about ReaComp, Reaper's stock compression plugin. Every switch, button, knob, and slider explained. Let's get in the weeds. First off, what is compression? Audio compression is the process of reducing the dynamic range between the loudest parts and the quietest parts of your audio signal. Compression can boost the quieter parts or attenuate the louder parts. So if your signal looks like this, compression can make it sound like this. There are a ton of reasons you will want to use compression on your tracks. But this video is specifically about how to use ReaComp, so we're not going to deep dive, or rather get into the weeds, on any one of these. ReaComp is the stock compression plugin that comes with Reaper, which means if you have Reaper installed, you have ReaComp installed. You can add it to any track by clicking the FX button and searching for comp, C-O-M-P, or ReaComp, R-E-A-C-O-M-P, and clicking on ReaComp and clicking on Add. While you're in the Add Effects window, you can also search under Categories, Dynamics. You can also search by developers and just look for Kakos. One of my favorite ways to add effects now is to just right-click the Effects button, and you have a list for recently used. You've got your categories, you've got your developers, and those are some ways to add ReaComp to your tracks. Let's finally get into the weeds with ReaComp. We're going to start with this envelope section. So what is an envelope? The envelope of a WAV file helps establish the sound's unique individual quality, and it has a significant influence over how we interpret and hear the sound. The envelope of a sound can be measured in 4 ways: attack, decay, sustain, and release. If you look at this graphic, you can see that most of the sounds that you record into Reaper follow this pattern in some form or fashion. So everything in this envelope section of the compressor has to deal with affecting the compression of those aspects of our signal: attack, decay, sustain, and release. We're going to start with the threshold. A threshold is how loud your signal has to go before the compressor kicks in, and it is typically expressed in decibels. The threshold defaults to 0 decibels and goes into negative numbers as you drag it down. Any signal that passes the threshold you set gets compressed. So I'm going to bring in a snare signal now and start to drag the threshold down, and you can see the green lines, which is our input. They are showing that our snare signal is passing the threshold. And over here in the gain reduction meter, you can see how much of the signal is being compressed, which is represented by the red bar that's coming down. And if you look at the decibel numbers in both the gain reduction meter and in the output mix meter, you can see the effect of the compression. And you can hear the effect of the compressor as it reduces the dynamics of this snare, pushing the loudest parts of the snare signal down every time it passes the threshold. Ratio. So now that we've set the threshold of when our compressor starts compressing, let's talk about ratio. Ratio is the amount of compression that is being applied when the compressor is activated, and it's typically expressed as, well, a ratio: 2:1, 4:1, 8:1. If you look at this image, you can see how the ratio works. At a 1:1 ratio, your input levels are the same as your output levels. So basically, if you had 10 decibels coming into your compressor, you'd have 10 decibels coming out of your compressor. Nothing is being compressed. Now, at a 2:1 ratio, every decibel of signal over the threshold will be compressed by 50% effectively. So if you had 10 decibels of gain over your threshold, you're only going to have 5 decibels of output. The compressor is going to squash or compress the signal over the threshold by a 2:1 ratio, 50%. Similarly, at a 4:1 ratio, if you had 4 decibels of gain over the threshold, you're only going to have 1 decibel of output. At infinity to 1, the volume of the signal is going to be limited at the threshold level. I'm going to apply some different ratios to this signal, and you can hear the difference. At the higher ratios, you can hear the snare hit that is exceeding our threshold just getting squashed more and more as the ratio increases. Before we talk about attack and release, let's discuss transients. Transients are the initial, louder, and more articulated bursts of energy that you hear at the start of most sounds. You can see on this snare hit where the transient is pretty extreme when the drumstick actually hits the drum head, and then very quickly the sound tail fades away. Transients are present in most sounds we record though, from a pick hitting the guitar strings to the beginning of words and plosives in your vocals. You can see them pretty clearly in your waveforms. So what are attack and release? Attack and release, usually expressed in milliseconds, determine how fast or slow the compressor activates after the threshold is exceeded and for how long the compression is applied. Attack is responsible for how much of the initial transient gets past the compressor before the compressor applies itself to the signal. This image shows an uncompressed signal. Now, if we apply a threshold of where we want the compressor to activate, the blue line represents the compressor activating and deactivating, and the pink line represents a signal that is compressed, the gain reduction, and thus only the green parts of the signal would be what we hear, the output. A fast attack, which would be a small amount of milliseconds, means that the compressor will apply full compression once the audio signal exceeds the threshold, but only after the duration of the attack time that we set. A slow attack, which would be a longer amount of milliseconds, means the compressor would take some time to apply full compression to the audio signal once the audio signal exceeds the threshold. Attack times will sound best at different times depending on the source and the sound you are trying to achieve. So here's some pros and cons to different attack times. Slow or longer attack times can give a track more impact and punchiness because you're letting those transients through. But it's also possible that the track would make uneven performance dynamics even worse depending on the source. Fast or shorter attack times can soften initial transients and give you a more controlled and processed sound. Everything's going to sound more even, but it's also possible that compressing your transients too much could suck the life out of the sound. Release. While the attack time applies to how our compressor behaves once a signal has surpassed the threshold, the release applies to how our compressor behaves after the signal drops back down below the threshold. A fast release means the compressor lets go quickly after its initial clamp down, while a slow release suggests that the processor holds on, compressing a little while longer before releasing the compression. It's important to note that a compressor with a slow release time will continue to compress the signal even after it has dropped below the threshold. In this example, you can hear and see in the gain reduction meter that the fast release time returns very quickly to being uncompressed until the next transient goes above the threshold. But the slower release times are continuing to compress the signal long after the transient has subsided below the threshold. Auto release. The auto release function will automatically adjust the release time to prevent sudden and dramatic compression changes. Aggressive attack or release times or extremely slow attack or release times can cause very audible compression artifacts in your output, meaning you can hear the compressor pumping or breathing. This might be intentional or it might be unwanted, and if it's unwanted, this is the kind of thing the auto release could help with. Again, this works with the release times that you set. It does not just automatically adjust your release times for you, but it attempts to make the release times that you've set to be a little bit smoother. The knee. A compressor knee refers to how the compressor transitions between the non-compressed and compressed states of an audio signal that's running through it, right around the threshold. Some compressors have what's known as a hard knee and a soft knee option, but in ReaComp, we have a decibel setting. With a 0 decibel setting, you effectively have a hard knee, and increasing the decibels allows you to control how soft the knee becomes. A soft knee gradually eases into the compression, causing a less audible compressed effect than its hard counterpart. The knee size determines the range of volume which the compressor will use in applying the compression ratio. For example, with a ratio of 4:1 and a knee setting of 0 decibels, let's say our signal exceeded the threshold that we've set by 8 decibels. The full 4:1 ratio will be applied as soon as the threshold is exceeded, assuming a 0 attack time. This would be considered a hard knee. Now with a knee size of 8 decibels, the hard edge of the threshold is expanded, it becomes softer, and the ratio will be gradually increased from a ratio of 1:1 before the threshold level is reached, and eventually reaching the full 4:1 ratio when the volume exceeds the threshold by a full 8 decibels. This would be considered a soft knee. Some people call the soft knee a smudging of the threshold. I'll be extreme in this example so you can really hear the difference between the 0 decibels, the hard knee, and the 24 decibels, the soft knee. And you can see the gain reduction kicking in before the threshold with the bigger knee, and it lasts for longer with each transient. So you can adjust the knee sizes on your tracks to get as much of a hard or soft sound as you want. Again, a hard knee kicks in when the signal passes the threshold. The soft knee kicks in before that depending on how many decibels you set your knee size to. Pre-comp, or pre-compression, allows the compressor to begin a specified number of milliseconds before the threshold is reached. This function might sound similar to the knee, and it does perform a slightly similar function, but where a knee bends the threshold or smudges it based on a set number of decibels you set, the pre-comp performs what other compressors sometimes call a look-ahead, and it gradually begins the compression a set number of milliseconds before your threshold is reached. So, based on your settings, the compression would begin to take hold before the signal the compressor was reacting to can be affected. This allows the compressor to be at 100% when the actual signal comes along. This is useful for some aggressive transients or if you just want to smooth the initial transients out of any sound. Let's listen to some examples and specifically look at where the transients hit. The result is that your gain reduction starts before the material that caused it for however many milliseconds you set. Without pre-compression, you can see that the gain reduction is happening at the exact moment that the transient spikes above the threshold. But with pre-compression, and I've put this at 150 milliseconds, which is pretty high, you can actually, if you listen to the sound, you can watch the gain reduction happening before the transient hits. So the pre-compression is kicking in kind of well before, 150 milliseconds, but well before the transient actually crosses the threshold. Classic attack and weird knee. The classic attack and weird knee are both legacy settings from previous versions of Reaper and ReaComp. If you use any of the stock presets, you will see that weird knee is always enabled, and the factory default has both selected. This was done in order to not audibly change or upset any previous recordings, presets, or FX chains that users who have been using Reaper for a long time have in their saved settings from previous versions. What this means for you: with Classic Attack enabled, the compression ratio is gradually reduced as the volume increases above the threshold. This seems a little counterintuitive, but this allows the loudest passages to pass uncompressed more so than without this enabled. So you still need to set your attack times, but the result will be subtle, but more of your loudest transients will make it through the compressor. Weird knee, on the other hand, is hard to understand and hard to explain, and again, it's a legacy setting. But the background from what I've been able to figure out is that for a long time, the knee setting in ReaComp was not working the way users expected it to. People even reported it in bug tickets to Kakos. I can tell by using it that it is less responsive than the current knee and doesn't perform as much gain reduction as our current knee setting. I have links in the description below from the Kakos forums that go into more detail if you want to read more about it. But unless you have a legacy project and sound dialed into that project that you want to keep, I would just suggest using the current knee and finding the settings that you want to work with. High pass and low pass. So this whole section down here I consider to be the detector section. What I mean by that is that this section determines what the compressor is reacting to. How is it detecting signal that it needs to compress? Each of these sliders and drop-downs here affect what the compressor is reacting to in some way. So let's start with the high pass and the low pass. A high pass filter lets every frequency above your selected setting pass. So everything above 500 Hertz, say, would let all the frequencies higher than 500 Hertz pass it and block out all the frequencies below 500 Hertz. A low pass filter would conversely let everything below your chosen setting pass. So a low pass filter set at 500 Hertz again would only let frequencies from 0 to 500 Hertz pass and block out everything from 501 Hertz to 20,000 Hertz. These two filters in ReaComp determine which frequencies from your signal the compressor is going to use to decide if it should compress. The use case here is, what if you only wanted the compressor to kick in on the bassy parts of your track? Or what if you only wanted to compress some high frequencies, like from a cymbal that was too loud? By setting your high pass and low pass filters, you get to decide which frequencies the compressor will react to, and it's only when those frequencies pass the threshold that compression is applied. It's still applied to the entire track, but it's only reacting when it hears certain frequencies that you set. So I've specifically created a track here with alternating high and low keyboard parts. We're going to set up one compressor to only compress when it detects the low frequencies and the other to only compress when it detects the high frequencies. Okay, so let's kick in our compressor that is only going to look for frequencies below 250 Hertz. You can see it's only compressing the low signal. If we use the preview filter button, which allows us to hear what the compressor is hearing, the preview filter is only letting us hear the frequencies that are getting past our filters. We can clearly hear it's just the low frequencies. We do the exact same thing with our high compressor that's only looking for things above 2800 Hertz. It's only compressing the high frequencies of this signal. And if we use the preview filter again, we're only going to hear the high frequencies because this is what the compressor is looking for. So the preview filter allows us to see what the compressor is hearing, audibly see. And so at the end of the day, high pass and low pass filter let us target our compressor to specific frequencies if we want to by controlling how the compressor detects frequencies that it needs to compress. The RMS size, or root mean square size. It simply instructs ReaComp to determine the compression level based on averaging the signal level over some period of time, milliseconds in this case, rather than on an instantaneous peak value. There's math involved with root mean square size. You can go look it up on Wikipedia. Between the quietest sections of the audio and the loudest sections is where the RMS value is created. And the time we set the RMS size to will determine the region where ReaComp is averaging the size. Practically speaking, it simply slows down the compression response. The higher the RMS setting, the more smoothed out our signal will be, averaging it, if you will, in determining the compression that is applied. Our extreme peaks and troughs in the signal will be averaged. Detector input is about where the compressor, ReaComp, is getting the signal that is triggering it. This defaults to main input left-right, and in most cases, this is where you want to keep your track compression. This just means that the compressor will be getting its signal and effectively figuring out what triggers it from the same track that you want to compress. But you can direct your compressor to use a different signal that effectively gives it a different set of instructions about when to compress. So for this example, I have a snare track and a keyboard track that is playing a single sustained note. I've named that track sidechain in this example, and I have routed the snare track to the auxiliary input left-right on our keyboard track. So I'm sending the snare signal to our auxiliary inputs on our keyboard track. What I'm doing here is going to be called sidechain compression, which is a whole video unto itself. So for now, let's just go with the idea that our snare signal is now additionally routed to our keyboard's compressor as well. So when we change the detector input on the keyboard channel to the auxiliary left-right, the compressor is now using the routed snare signal that we sent here as its guidance on when to compress. If we listen to the preview filter, we can hear the snare. But when we turn the preview filter off, the compression on the keyboard channel is still only going to compress the keyboard signal, but it's doing this based on the snare signal's input. When I switch the detector input back to the main, it's using the sustained keyboard as its trigger, so you can see the difference when it's using the snare signal instead. So here are two examples of when you might want to use something like this. Let's say you have two tracks. One is background music and the other is people talking. And let's say anytime the people are talking, you might want to compress the background music. This would be useful in that context. Second example, let's say you have a bass track and a bass drum track. You may want to compress the bass track anytime the bass drum hits, so that the two tracks are not muddying each other up for the low frequencies in the mix. The output mix section is a section of controls that basically covers your mix after it's been processed, in this case by the compressor. The first thing you have is your output mix meter, which shows you your output levels while your track is playing. If your signal is too loud in that it exceeds 0 decibels, you will see a clip indicator at the top here, which turns the top of your output mix meter this dark yellow color. Real quick note on clipping, which you will see represented all over the place in Reaper and in other digital audio workstations. Your signal will clip if it exceeds 0 decibels, and this will often result in digital distortion, which is unpleasant to hear, and you want to avoid this always. So we have these two sliders, one for wet signal and one for dry signal. The wet mix is defaulted to 0 dB, and the dry mix is defaulted to negative infinity, which means no signal essentially. Your wet mix is the compressed signal, so this is after it's gone through the compressor, and you can choose how much gain you want to output from this track. You can increase it past 0 decibels if you want it to be louder and reduce it if you want it to be quieter. Dry is the uncompressed signal, and you can choose if you want to mix in some of that uncompressed signal with your compressed signal as you output it from this track. If you essentially put dry at 0 dB and your wet mix at negative infinity, it's the same as if you just turn the compressor off. So you can play with a combination of wet and dry signal and see what's best for your track. Auto makeup is a checkbox at the bottom of the output mix section. Its function is to make up some of the gain lost when you compress things, because compression again deals with controlling the dynamic range of your signal. So often if you compress a lot of your transients that are coming through, you are going to reduce the overall dynamics of your track, and auto makeup attempts to increase the gain in direct proportion to the threshold and the ratio. So if your threshold is very high and your ratio is set to 1:1, pressing the auto makeup button is not going to do anything. But if you start to increase your ratio and start to pull your threshold down lower where your signal is being compressed, it's passing over the threshold, your ratio is kicking in, the auto makeup is going to programmatically work with those two settings, threshold and ratio, to increase the gain proportional to make everything set at 0 decibels. You can basically also do auto makeup yourself by addressing the output mix gain after you have compressed the signal by increasing it, but it's a handy box to be able to check to just raise your entire track's gain level after you've applied some compression. The limit output checkbox attempts to limit the output of your signal to 0 decibels. So if it is exceeding 0 decibels, by checking this checkbox, you will tell your compressor to basically not send anything to the output mix that is over 0 decibels. Reaper actually comes loaded with several JS stock limiters that are just default plugins that you can add that have parameters of their own. This is not that. This is a single checkbox within the compressor that will just limit your output to 0 decibels. It's important to note that your track controls, you have a volume slider on your track, you can still exceed 0 decibels on your track slider, and that will make your track clip. What the limiter in the compressor does though, is it just limits the output of what's coming out of your compressor to 0 decibels. You can see that here in the example, that it is hitting that ceiling of 0 decibels when I have this box checked. Limiting an extremely loud signal that wants to go well over 0 decibels can lead to some audible artifacts that might not be pleasant, that might be a little harsh and a little crunchy. So you want to be careful with this box and adjust your output gain as necessary. But it is handy to be able to limit things and not have them be constantly clipping or just going over the clip mark. So this top bar exists in most stock Reaper plugins. What these kind of options do for you is, the first one, you have a drop down for just your presets. You're going to see a lot of presets here for different kind of instruments, and this is just kind of a starting point for basic compression for each of these kind of instruments. You can use them, you can play with them. If you like one that you've done either custom or a couple of small tweaks off of the preset, you can save it with this plus button. You can save your own preset and it will add it to this drop-down list. The parameters section is cool. This is a way that you can see your track envelope, which you can use to later automate. This is also where you can add parameters from your effects to the track itself. So you don't actually have to go into the effects, open up the compressor in this case. You could just put things like threshold and ratio on the track itself and adjust them from there. This next one is a routing matrix. This speaks a little bit to the sidechain compression that we were talking about earlier. If you wanted to see a routing matrix, which is another video I will do, but this is where you could easily control the routing matrix of where this track is going, where things are coming from. The UI box is a way to see all the parameters in this effect without any user interface. So this is just the raw numbers, and you could modify it from there. These last two, the checkbox basically will turn the effect on and off. It's the exact same as if you went over to the list of effects you have and checked the box or unchecked the box. The dial here is how much of this effect is going to get applied to this channel. This is different from the output mix wet dry, which is combining what's coming out of your compressor. This is applying the whole compressor. So if you only wanted 50% of this compression on all the settings that you put in to be applied to this channel, you could do that here. All right, and that is all I've got for today's Reaper in the Weeds in-depth look at ReaComp. To the best of my ability, that is every knob, slider, button, and meter explained in that effect. More videos are on the way. If you like the content, go ahead and like and subscribe. Thank you.